Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Hello and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hockton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster. Greek mythology was such a huge part of my upbringing. I knew my Apollo from my Aphrodite. I can still recount the voyages and discuss Jason with you. I can tell you about the labors of Heracles. And the funny thing is, when so much has changed, in the things that we actually tell children these days, the way that we actually educate them and introduce them to, the culture of the world, Greek myths have actually endured. And I find that fascinating. Hey, just as a footnote, the first Greek mythology film that I saw was Jason and the Golden Fleece, and it still brings a smile to my face now. I think it was made in 1963, and I think I must have seen it, I guess in the 70s, and I've seen it a number of times since. But there's some amazing scenes in it with really early visual effects, skeletons that come to life, and there's an incredible clockwork owl, very astronomatic, type creation, really beautifully done. And it was actually all done by a motion animator by the name of Ray Harryhausen. And here's the connection, because you can always find one if you look close enough. The whole 6 degrees of separation. Well, I think with the platforms these days, it's probably three degrees of separation. That guy actually taught my best friend, DJ John Desjardins, who's an absolute VFX legend. Well, he actually worked with that guy when he first got into the industry. So how about that? And DJ, if you're listening, a big hello to you. I hope you and your family are well. So Greek mythology for me holds significant importance due to its profound cultural influences. It offers timeless narratives that explore, I think, the fundamental aspects of human nature, not to mention, moral quandaries and social values. It actually provides insight, I think, into the complexities of the human condition, serving as a repository of wisdom and moral guidance. Moreover, I think it's also contributed extensively to the development of Western literature, art, and language, with its archetypal characters and themes, which continue to inspire storytellers across generations even today. And of course, there are so many stories that I'd like to tell, but I want to tell one particular story about a particular group that have all of the above qualities that we just talked about, who have actually been there from the beginning of Greek mythology, from the beginning, and it's the Furies. So who were they? What were they? And what was their role in the Greek world? Okay, so it's obvious that I love Greek mythology, but why are these stories so enduring? Well, my theory, for what it's worth, is that it's because Greek mythology has human beings at its center. So even when it focuses on gods, like Poseidon or whoever, they have a lot of very human characteristics. So essentially the currency of Greek myth is human life. People are transformed or changed in terms of metamorphosis, and virtually every variant of animal and plant available, they're turned into those. Gods behave and misbehave with relation to each other and also to human beings. But essentially it operates on a really kind of manageable, comprehensible scale. So the idea of, some gigantic creature doing some gigantic thing at a level we can't possibly comprehend, as you find in mid-cycles like Norse mythology, for example. It's not really such a thing there. They go, oh, well, once upon a time, we had this big chasm, chaos, and there were the heavens, and then that was it. And then we start getting people who have characteristics that we can actually really get our teeth into and really get hold of. And I think that's why Greek mythology is so compelling. And the weird thing to me about it is that it feels like people have kept on adding to it. There's no original version to any myth because ancient Greece is 2,000 years long. So from the beginning of what we would call ancient Greece to the sort of later time, almost its end, which was during the Roman Empire, from beginning to end, that's like as far as us now going back to Julius Caesar. That's a long, long time. And those stories are burbling up across the Greek world continuously, which is massive across all that time. So when people ask me what's the real version of a story that I've just told them, what was the original story? The simple answer is there's no such thing. There's always moments where there are counter myths coming across, because often local societies want to adopt a particular hero or heroine. Let me give you an example of that. The version of the story where Helen actually goes to Egypt rather than to Troy, it's as old, at least, as Homer. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the Trojan War because of the Iliad, but we spend little time thinking of Euripides' play Helen, which literally begins with Helen saying, "Hello, I'm on the banks of the Nile." So it's actually pretty clear where she is. She's on the banks of the Nile in Egypt. And we forget that. So they change and they morph, and they change and they morph because we take them and we make them into what we want them to be. And you know what? There's actually nothing wrong with that. I spend my time sad. I'm a little bit sad that we don't actually have more classical texts. And on this occasion, I'm actually sad that Helen actually survived, because it confuses people. And I always thought it was, that classicists described Helen as a problem play. But you know what? Then Frank McGuinness actually translated it for, I think it was the Globe Theatre about 10 to 15 years ago. And it's that thing where you realize that in the hands of a master dramatist like Frank McGuinness clearly is, you just go, oh, actually, it's not the problem of the play. It's your problem. It's your misinterpretation. But look, I don't think that really matters. The women, it feels like a very fertile place. Greek myths, this is, to find stories and characters, if you're interested in telling stories about women from the point of view of women, where women actually have agency. And I love that. Obviously, sometimes, they are victims, but women play a more prominent part in Greek mythology. And this is something that we tended to sometimes not notice or sometimes, disregard. But get this, we actually have, and I always like to make this point, but we still have 8 surviving tragedies about the Trojan War by Euripides, and 7 of them have women as their title characters. Only one, which is the Orestes, has a man as the title character. So what I love about that is that, Euripides obviously knew that if you wanted to find the drama in a war, it wasn't necessarily on the battlefield that's actually covered really well with epic, but it was elsewhere in the build-up to the war, in the aftermath of the war. And here's the thing. At the end, Alfriginalis, spoiler alert, it turns out she actually isn't sacrificed. She's actually substituted with a deer. And so she survives in order to become a priestess who sacrifices people. So let's talk about the Furies. Who are the Furies? The Furies are 3 really quite ancient goddesses. So they are perhaps the children of Uranus. I'm sure you know this already, and I always feel bad saying this to the male listeners because it makes them clench their buttocks ever so slightly. When Uranus is actually castrated, some of his semen falls into the sea and becomes Aphrodite, and some of his blood falls on the land that becomes the Furies. And this is all from the very early sources. But later sources have them as the daughters of night, Nooks, night, and they are revenge goddesses. So originally they start out as just sort of fairly nameless revenge creatures, and then gradually over time they develop personalities. And of course they're going to do that because we like them. I mean, who doesn't like the Furies? And they develop an impetus of their own. So there's usually 3 of them, and they pursue relentlessly. So if you commit a crime, particularly against a family member, never a good thing, a sort of, unforgivable crime as we might think, well, they will then pursue you until you can no longer cope. Let's just put it that way. So their most celebrated victim is Orestes, who they pursue because he has murdered his mother, Clytemnestra. And they're interesting divine creatures because they're the embodiment of things that we feel, like we are haunted by. So they're both independent entities, and they're also very easy. It's very easy to read them as a, psychological embodiment. And a lot of Greek myths work like this, which I think is another reason they're so compelling. Let me give you an example. Okay, so desire is a very internal thing. So if I were to walk into a crowded room and see a very beautiful person and fall for them, we would assume that that was on me, that I'd walked into the room desperate to fall for them. We might assume that. But we also might assume, if we're a wee bit passive aggressive, assume that it was on them, that they're so beautiful that I couldn't help but fall for you. But what we wouldn't do probably is assume it was on a third party. So Aphrodite floating invisibly alongside you, just imposing desire on you, whether you actually wanted it or not. And for the Greeks, that's a really plausible way of describing, because they don't have a language of psychology yet that allows you to describe what happens when something like that happens, when it would actually be better for you to go home to your loyal partner, but you instead decide to, snog a stranger. They don't have words for that. So they know Aphrodite inflicts you. So there you have it. You've got it covered. If you think that love could be an externally applied force, then revenge suddenly seems a bit more, or vengeance or desire for justice suddenly seems a bit more real in that sense. We do have, I think, as a society and as individuals, I guess, a sense that things should be fair. It's actually one of the earliest things that kids say, isn't it? That's not fair. So, when a terrible thing is done by somebody, I think we do tend to think that there should be a consequence for that, that they should pay a price. And that's exactly where the Furies come in. They're the ones that you call down to take that act of revenge for you. For the Furies, the price is always, I think, pretty well at the extreme end of what we consider, what we would consider to be reasonable. So Orestes, well, they pursue him relentlessly, and what they're trying to do is drive him to suicide. So they torment you to the point of wanting to end it all. This is actually in the third play of the Oresteia, where the goddess Athene, who is about to, hear the charge against Orestes, when the Furies have pursued him all over the Greek world because he killed his mother. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Altodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa, but they are much more than that. When you sign up with Altodomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Altodomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. Now, Agamemnon, who's the leader of the Greeks. So this is the story. So he leads the fleet off to Troy. But before the fleet can actually leave, his priest, a man called Calchas, tells him that he absolutely must sacrifice his daughter, Phrygialis, if there's to be a fair wind to get them to Troy. So he duly does that. Although, as we've said, in the Euripides version, at the last minute, a deer is actually swapped for a Phrygialis by the goddess herself, which always makes me wonder just how corrupt Calchas was, because if he was so right that this was the sacrifice that had to be made, how come, a miracle essentially has to occur in order to save her? I'm always a bit curious about that. I've thought about that a lot. Anyway, but the main story is that he actually kills his daughter, and when he comes back from Troy, she actually kills him. Orestes then has this terrible decision to make: avenge his father and kill his mother, or allow his father's ghost to go unsatisfied and let his mother thrive, having committed her crime. And the choice he makes along with his sister Electra is to kill their mother. But that, of course, means that they're guilty of a blood crime and that they will be pursued by the Furies. And as I just mentioned, Orestes is actually pursued all the way to Athens. And Athene will stand as his juror, it appears, or maybe his judge. And then she decides to kind of step back ever so slightly and essentially become more like a judge. So she's asking all these kind of leading questions. I guess you'd call her an interrogating judge. But she allows the jury to be man-made or made of ordinary men of Athens. So Orestes is essentially judged by his peers, and the Furies are actually the prosecution. It's basically a massive courtroom drama, this third, kind of play in the trilogy. And what they say is, we want to demand satisfaction for Clytemnestra because, he killed his mother and that was completely unacceptable. It's a blood crime. And this is a really elemental law. And I was about to say in ancient Greece, but generally, I think as humans, we'd all kind of pretty well go with don't kill your parents, wouldn't you? I mean, I'm really in favor of that law. And it's not country specific. And that's another great thing about the Furies is that they perhaps represent a time of laws that we would consider to be simply true. We will always think that murder is wrong, I think, probably. And murdering your parents has to be doubly wrong. And of course, there are more culturally specific things where we might say, these things have changed over time. I mean, there's a really interesting case in Plato's Euthyphro, which really illustrates how cultures change, because Euthyphro is prosecuting his father for having murdered a slave. And his family are actually really appalled that he would do such a thing. But to me, Euthyphro looks incredibly reasonable. He actually thinks all human life is the same. But to Socrates and to Euthyphro's family, he looks like a terribly disloyal son. So a perfect example of how values have changed over time. So Furies-wise, it's a little bit like our use of King Arthur, I think. As a novelist, you can just bring King Arthur to serve, a particular purpose. And the Furies appear elsewhere, obviously. And sometimes the crimes that they have to pursue people for, well, they actually don't seem that bad to me. So the story that we get in the Iliad when Phoenix comes to talk to Achilles is that he explains the reason he's childless is because his father, whose name is Mentor, has been having an affair. I mean, this implies, and of course, that having an affair actually implies consent, which isn't necessarily present with a younger woman. The word in Greek is palakis, which we usually translate to mean concubine. But again, that implies consent, which isn't necessarily present. And the reason I say that is because it's not entirely clear in the story. Anyway, Phoenix's mother then pleads with him on bended knee. I mean, this whole thing is so desperate for analysis by Freud. She pleads with him to have sex with her father's new sexual partner because she feels dishonored by this. And she thinks if this nameless woman has sex with her son, he'll no longer fancy her husband. It's like paging Dr. Freud, paging Dr. Freud. But yeah, the Furies don't in that instance drive Phoenix, who's, cursed by his father. His father calls down the Furies upon him, but it's not for death. It's for childlessness. And that's why Phoenix remained childless in this story particularly. So you can request the Furies when you need them. It has to be quite an elemental thing. It's usually death, but it's certainly, in the case of Phoenix, it isn't. Telemachus says at the beginning of the Odyssey, when he is asked why he doesn't just chuck his mother out of the house when he's sick of the suitors being in his home and calling on his home and constantly ringing the bell. And he says, because she'd be able to call down the Furies on me. So what you see is a sort of Furies aversion. And that's because the Furies exist, at least as far as he's concerned. And that's why, and that actually stops him from from committing a crime against his mother. I mean, at the very least, it would be antisocial behavior, right? To render her homeless. But he wouldn't do it because the only reason he is thinking about doing it is because he doesn't like the young men, the suitors who are coming to, ply for a hand. So the fact that the Furies are in his worldview, it stops him from stepping out of line. And that's interesting by itself. So sometimes they might seem to behave really terrifyingly, as with Orestes, but here they're sort of maintaining social order. And I have to admit, I like the Furies. I think there's something to be said for a sense of sort of society-bound value or values that means the same, that stops us from doing these terrible things. And I think why it's so prevalent today is I think we've lived through a time when public servants felt really capable of saying something wholly untrue or wholly contradictory, of a previous sentiment. And then when asked, to justify the change, have actually said, yeah, I never said that. That wasn't me. And there's video evidence of them actually doing it, and yet they still deny it. And I would quite like a sense that, as a society, we say that's actually really bloody unacceptable. You should be absolutely ashamed of yourself. And politicians worldwide, just an example, where the Furies should be called in, are getting away not just with theft, but making the most outrageous comments and then denying they ever said it. Where are the Furies when you need them? But it also feels kind of very relatable in that way that we all tell each other the reason that murderers and people that commit appalling crimes, but go unpunished in this life, we can't believe that they're actually not haunted to the end of their days. I mean, I hope they are. You'd have to hope that, don't you? But we believe that, don't we? Because the alternative is often that they get away with it scot-free. It's like if you steal the money from an old lady next door, I'd like to believe that you're actually not going to enjoy that money because you're going to be absolutely haunted by the horrors of what you've done. I mean, that surely is why we love Hamlet. It's why Hamlet is such an extraordinary play, and why Macbeth is such an extraordinary play. There's this sense that if you do something terrible or if you've witnessed something unavenged, you can't rest easy. And that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth both struggle with guilt. That Hamlet knows that if he doesn't avenge his father, just like Orestes, that his father's ghost is going to haunt him for the rest of his days. And he has to act to stop that happening. The Furies, I think, are really interesting in terms of being female because Apollo really despises them. And look, I have to say, Apollo is such a bloody misogynist, but one of the things that he hates them for is being like horrible ancient children. He actually calls them that because they go all the way back to the beginning. They are old gods, and he isn't. But there's also something kind of childlike about them too, perhaps because of their moral outlook. It's so simplistic, that as adults we would say, well, sometimes it's a bit more complicated than that, It doesn't take very much for us to think that there might be times when we don't think it's the worst thing you could do to kill a parent. And I'm just saying, there are times when the Furies being called in, it's too simplistic. But in this day and age, if you had an abusive parent, if you were trying to protect your younger siblings from that abusive parent, I actually think it's okay. Yes, it's absolutely still morally wrong to commit murder, but maybe I would consider that as manslaughter, or maybe I would consider that as a variant of self-defense. I would actually like some nuance on that judgment. I wouldn't want to just say anybody who kills any parent is definitely evil, because it's just not the case. But the Furies were here in the Earth's beginning, and the Furies are much more simplistic than that. And I think that's why I find them in many ways so appealing. I quite like moral simplicity, I'm always here with my kind of, oh yes, but what if philosophy type arguments. And then every now and then you think, I think it's actually quite good to have people who just see things in this totally white, clear light, and people who actually say, you know what, you actually did the wrong thing, apologize, or you did the wrong thing and you have to atone for that. The Furies actually have different roles. I'm not sure whether I have a favorite Fury either, basically because in terms of who does what, because they all pretty well do the same thing. They're revenge gods. But my favorite representation of them, I think, are always on vase paintings. You get those amazing Greek vases, and some of them are absolutely jaw-droppingly gorgeous. Well, I love the Furies on those. There's something glorious about Furies on vase paintings. I know it sounds like a really weird thing to say, but Google it. They look amazing. And I like them because our literary sources are all about them being, terrifying, disgusting creatures. They've got horrible matted hair. Their eyes they're always watering and disgusting and sort of dripping. But when you see them on vase paintings, they look weirdly young and oddly, I think, incredibly cool. cool. And they wear these sort of kind of lace-up boots that I quite like, that have slightly kind of, a Doc Martin vibe. And they wear, sort of tunic skirts to, down to kind of knee-length skirts, or maybe just a bit below. They have snakes, but not like Gorgons, had snakes kind of growing out of their heads, but sort of, they have really kind of slinky snakes, kind of coiling up their arms, going through their hair. And what I also like about them is that they always look so exhausted, because they're always in pursuit, aren't they? So they're always out there in pursuit. And when they're resting, when they're depicted resting, either in the underworld because their quarry is now caught, they're always like leaning on each other, exhausted. One's got a head in the other one's lap. They just look they look really sisterly, and I find them absolutely adorable. And like Athena, with her outfit, you always know the Furies. Pythias says that at the beginning of the Eumenides, she says, oh, they look a bit like Gorgons. But actually, they don't look like Gorgons. And then she corrects herself. And she says, they look a bit like the creatures that steal from Phineus. In other words, harpies. And then she says, oh no, they don't look like that either. So she's trying to find things to compare them to, but she struggles. I actually think the Furies are just the Furies. I don't think they look like anything else apart from the Furies. And I think they're easily identifiable. What I absolutely love about them is that their very presence to me strikes fear into mortals and gods alike. They're these ancient goddesses that haunt the shadows, their every movement, echoing with the chilling whispers of curses, kind of yet to be unleashed. I love that. To encounter the Furies is to face the unyielding wrath of the cosmos itself. That's how powerful a force these chicks are. It's a force as primal and eternal as the very foundation of the earth. That's why I love them. So remember, when something really, really pisses you off, call in the Furies. They'll do your bidding for you. Thanks very much, guys, and I'll look forward to talking to you again next week. Bye for now.